This is the Prestigious Initiative. Welcome. I'm Chris Bean. Today with me we have Mr. Jim Marshall joining us. Jim Marshall is the discoverer of Septemics, a hitherto unknown natural phenomenon that greatly aids in the understanding of people. And today we're going through a section of his book that is Septemics. Jim, how are you today?
Hi, Chris.
All right, so we're going to dive back into the group scales where we left off and the scale of civilization.
Okay. Well, this has several different ramifications. First of all, the word civilization comes from the Latin word civitas, which means city. Because at that time, when the word was invented, the civilized people were all in cities, and the people who were outside were barbarians or primitives. So this is a scale that shows you how civilization develops. Now, that does not mean how society develops, because you can have societies that are not civilized. In other words, societies that are primitive or barbaric. This is how civilization develops. And it doesn't mean that these things can only come about in this way. But if you study civilization, you will see that it develops in this sequence. Also, it tells you a lot about when you assess a society, how civilized is it? If the society is heavily weighted at or near the top of the scale, that is a very healthy society. And if it's weighted at the bottom, that's an unhealthy society, which at first blush is a scathing indictment of contemporary industrialized society because it's heavily weighted at the bottom, which tells you that it's not civilized. But I don't think that's news to anybody who knows what the word civilized means, because most of what goes on in the world is barbaric. Now let's look at the type of scale. This is a linear scale, meaning there's no apparent congruence between levels 1 and 7. It's a gradual scale, meaning there is a gradation between each of the levels, so you go gradually from one level to the next. And it's a general scale, meaning once you assess a particular society against this, you're done with it. It's not context-driven. Unless you want to say that studying it in the context of the Chinese society, as opposed to studying it in the context of the Egyptian society, for example, would be context. But that's not generally how this is understood. What are we measuring here? This is an important thing. What makes civilization? So the dotted vertical line tells you above level 1, you have spirituality and conceptualism. So to the extent that a society has spiritual and conceptual dimensions to it, it's civilized. That's what civilization is. And to the extent that it's solid and materialistic, which is the opposite of spiritual and conceptual, it is less civilized. So below level 7, you have solidity and materialism. Above level 1, you have spirituality and conceptualism. So that is the gradation here. So you could think of spirituality in a sense of being synonymous with conceptualism. And you can think of solidity as being synonymous with materialism. And material is solid and concepts are spiritual. So that's what this is measuring. And so this gives you an objective yardstick by which to look at a society. And you can see that every civilization starts at level 1 and then develops down to level 7. So at level 1, you have philosophy. Philosophy literally means the love of wisdom. And that's essentially reason, which is what makes humans different from all the other species on Earth. We can reason. We can do geometry and algebra. all the other creatures cannot. So it starts out as a philosophy. Now, if you study Western civilization or the Western tradition, as it is often called, you'll see that the philosophy is a Greek word. It started out in Greece about 2,500 years ago. And most people know about the famous Greek philosophers. You have the pre-Socratic philosophers and post-Socratic philosophers. And the dividing line there in the middle of all of it was Socrates, who was really the central personage of that movement, who, in a sense, because he was given a choice between poison and banishment, chose the poison. So he was essentially executed. And so, in a sense, that in the Greco-Roman tradition, Socrates occupies the position that in Judeo-Christian society, Jesus occupies. Because in Jesus, you have the Bible for Christians is divided into Old Testament, New Testament, and the dividing line is Jesus. So Socrates and Jesus are really the two central seminal figures in Western civilization, because Western civilization is essentially a product of Greco-Roman and Judeo-Christian traditions mingled. So once you have a philosophy, then that philosophy gives you a religion. The religion comes from the philosophy. In other words, people think wise thoughts about things, and eventually that becomes codified into a religion. Now, religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means to bind back. So it's the element of binding. Religion is about belief. Belief is a very different thing from reason. If you talk to people, you will see that some people are driven by belief and some people are driven by reason. They're two very different things. People who are driven by reason are not keen on belief, and vice versa. For instance, people say, well, I believe that Jesus is the Son of God. Well, that's a belief. What are you going to do with that? That's religion. That's not philosophy. Now, of course, it is possible to study the philosophical aspects of all religions without adhering to the beliefs. And that is a category that has been burgeoning, where when you ask people, what is your religion? They say spiritual, but not religious. You'll see that showing up on checklists now. That is a choice that many people make today, spiritual, but not religious. So in other words, they embrace the philosophy of a variety of religions, some group of religions, but are not bound by belief, because belief binds you. That's why religion is the word used. It's a binding. So once you have belief, then you get into law and morals. So different societies have different beliefs. So in the old American frontier, rustling, which would mean the stealing of cattle and horses, was a capital crime. They hanged you for that. Now, obviously, that's no longer true, but that was the belief. So in order for the ranchers to survive, they had to have that law. So a rancher would go out and he'd see that several hundred of his cows were missing. So he would call all of his hands and all of his neighbors, and they would follow the trail of the herd. And eventually it would lead them to the rustlers, and they would throw a rope over a tree and hang the rustlers. That was common practice. And that was an accepted practice in the American frontier. So morals are basically laws. There's really no conceptual or meaningful difference between morals and laws. Now, of course, in society, we say, well, this is a law, this is illegal, this is immoral. Like it's immoral to fool around with somebody else's wife, but it's not illegal. But there's still rules that you live by. So law comes from religion. You can see this easily in the Old Testament, where you got the Ten Commandments growing out of this religion, this monotheistic religion that the Jews had. And from that came all kinds of other laws that developed over the years from that. So once you have laws, then you can have the social sciences. In other words, the laws and the morals determine your culture. And culture is what you study in social sciences. So that is the next step down. Then, once you have culture, then you get art, because the art is really a reflection of the culture. So if you look at different societies, you see the art is very different because it's a reflection of the culture. So aesthetics is a sub-study of philosophy, just as ethics is a sub-study of philosophy. Ethics would be at level 3. Aesthetics would be at level 5. So after you have a culture, then you get art. People are agreed upon what's beautiful and what's not. So some people think, well, it's beautiful for women to have long hair, and so that's considered aesthetic, and you see that showing up in the art. So then after you have arts, then you get crafts. Crafts are there to pursue the sense of what's beautiful. In other words, we have this idea that people's faces should look a certain way. So we have plastic surgeons. That's a craft. That's a technology. We have an idea that people should be able to get from work to home quickly and easily. And so we have automobiles. That's a technology. You see, there's a craft around creating that technology. And then after you have crafts, then you have business, which is the last step. Because prior to craft, you can't really have business. You have to have some kind of technology in order to create something that you would have commerce about. So, for instance, the Native Americans were very good at making bows and arrows. So I'm sure there was some commerce. I'm sure that there was some guy in the village who was an expert arrow maker, and people would come to him and they would trade things, barter things, in order to get his arrows, because he made the best arrows, you see? So you get commerce growing out of that technology. So it was President Calvin Coolidge who said, if I can quote him exactly, the principal business of America is business. This is often misquoted as the business of America is business. And so if you study America, that's very true. America was always about commerce. Even in colonial times, one of the reasons that the Revolutionary War was fought was that most of the wealth to the English Empire came from the 13 American colonies. And they were not going to let that go. So America was always a commerce-heavy place, and it still is. So you have people in business. Now, most people will tell you that the people with the money control everything. And I don't know how you could argue with that. Because you have, for example, the head of Facebook. I'm sure you know his name. What's his name?
Oh, yeah.
I'm forgetting his name at the moment.
I can picture him.
So he He put up $400 million.
Zuckerberg.
$400 million in the last election. So he had a major impact on how the election turned out. You have Reid Hoffman, was until a few days ago was funding Nikki Haley. Reid Hoffman is a known liberal, and he's funding somebody who is a Republican running for the nomination for presidency. Well, when he saw the results that there's no pathway for her to possibly win, he said, I'm not doing this anymore. Pulled his money. But anyway, that's what's been going on. Everybody knows that George Soros is giving billions and billions of dollars. There's actually something in America called Soros prosecutors. So he would put up millions of dollars into elections to get the district attorney elected that he wanted. And this is so prevalent that they're now called Soros prosecutors. So these are all the prosecutors who are prosecuting Donald Trump. And whether or not you like Donald Trump, the legal actions that they're bringing against him are spurious. I can tell you from my knowledge of law and from a person who listens to legal scholars like Alan Dershowitz and Jonathan Turley, they all say these cases are not legitimate cases. Well, all of that was brought about because Soros influenced the elections to get the people he wanted in office so that they would go after Donald Trump or anybody like Donald Trump or anybody who supports Donald Trump. So, perfect example of how money comes from commerce and business, influences everything perversely. And people have been complaining about that for millennia, that the people with the money run everything. There was actually a book out in which a guy calculated that 6,500 people controlled Earth. He actually went through all these people. My estimate at this time, because that book was some years ago, is that at maximum, it's 8,000 people. Those are all very rich people. They're all millionaires and billionaires. Most of them are billionaires. So really, the billionaires around the world, I mean, Vladimir Putin started out from humble beginnings. How did he become a billionaire? I mean, the people have been wondering for years. Harry Reid, who was a senator from Nevada, came from humble beginnings. How did he wind up a billionaire? He certainly wasn't on the salary he got as a senator. It's not that much money. It's expensive to keep two homes and to live in Washington. So I think most people rightly conclude this is obviously corruption. So that's the bottom of the scale. And if you talk to people who are at these different levels, you can see that the people at the higher levels are more civilized than the people at the lower levels. So, for example, if you talk to philosophers are very civilized people. They don't have fist fights. They don't rob banks. They're not terrorists. You see? Well, below that, you have religion. Well, pastors and ministers and rabbis and gurus. See? They're about religion. They're pretty civilized people. I studied with the Society of Jesus. They're very civilized people. Very conspicuously civilized. They are so much more civilized than the general population that they really live in a kind of a cult. And I don't say that to criticize them. I understand why they do that, and it makes perfect sense. They have extremely high standards, morally, ethically, academically, uh, they're at level 2. You see? So Al Capone, probably the most famous mafioso who ever lived, famously said, I'm a businessman. People want alcohol, we give them alcohol. People want women, we give them women. People want gambling, we give them gambling. That's the way he thought of it. That's level 7. So now you have the cartels from Mexico, who now have a presence in all 50 of the United States, who have basically taken over the border and have taken over many countries. Most of the Latino countries are terrified of them. They kill journalists, they kill government people, they kill anybody who bothers them. And it is, I have seen information that the most recent election in Arizona was bought off by the cartels because Kerry Lake had said, running for governor, I will close the border. First day, I will call up the National Guard and close the border. Well, they couldn't have that. She was ahead by 11 points 1 week before the election and lost the election. How does that happen? How does that happen is they came in and they bribed the election officials and the judges. And if you study the actual trial, which I did, of Kerry Lake regarding election fraud, it's obvious to me that that was a wrong outcome. Well, that's what bribery is about. That is how the mafia survived for years. Everybody was bribed. The cops were bribed all the way up, the lieutenants, the captains, the judges, the assemblymen, the councilmen, they were all bribed. And so they looked the other way. And that's pretty much what goes on in the world. So during, for example, the Roman Empire, or even the Roman Republic, people think of it as a republic. Well, it was only a republic to the elites. It wasn't a republic for the rest of the people. They were just subjects. So everybody assumed that it was all about money. And that's level 7. So if you study Roman history, it's all about bribery and corruption. Caesar was famous for this. He bribed all kinds of people. That's how it worked. So he would bribe senators and they voted him dictator because he bribed them. That's what went on, and everybody knew it. And that's pretty much what's going on in the United States now. It's totally corrupt. Almost everybody knows it. On both sides. It's regardless of which side you're on. I mean, after the election in which Kerry Lake was defeated, they did a poll, and if I remember correctly, 84% of Arizonans suspected that there was fraud in the election. Now, when you get 84% of anything in a poll, that's close to a maximum. I mean, you're not going to get higher than that. You know, like if you ask people, should we murder babies if they're left-handed? There's a certain percentage of people that will say yes. You're not going to get 100%. You'll get maybe 95% because there are always sociopaths and psychopaths and crazy people and lunatics and maniacs. And most of these people are running around on the streets, so to speak. Most of these people are not behind bars, be they penal bars or mental institution bars. And in fact, there's a consensus that I heard from the mental health profession. It's like they think that about 50% of people are insane. And in fact, I have a friend who was a doctor of psychology, and he told me straight out, everybody's neurotic. Well, neurosis is a mental illness. So it's not a pretty picture. Anyway, if you study civilizations, you'll see this sequence. It develops in this way. That does not mean that some of these things don't exist in non-civilized contexts. I mean, you can go to a primitive society, they have some art, they have some crafts, they have some commerce, they have some culture. You see, they have these things. But if you're talking about developing a civilization, this is the sequence in which it develops. And this gives you a yardstick by which to measure a society. Is it heavy at the bottom? Is it heavy at the top? And a person, too. For example, social scientists are fairly civilized people. And the further down you go, the less civilized you are. So, for example, let's talk about craft. Let's talk about automobile repairmen. There are many automobile repairmen, millions of them, and they're not terribly civilized people, in case you haven't noticed. I don't mean to criticize them. I'm happy if I can find somebody who knows how to fix a car, who knows exactly what he's doing. I'm happy to pay them. But they're not terribly civilized people. These are not people who sit around listening to Beethoven, sipping white wine and eating brie, right? These are people who watch football and drink beer. So they are clearly, as a group, less civilized than, for example, religious people. Clergy are more civilized people. So this gives you a yardstick by which to measure how civilized is someone, how civilized is a group of people. Any questions?
No questions. Fascinating. Thank you.
Okay. This scale is more important than I can possibly state. This is actually, by itself, the pathway to success. This is a spiral scale, meaning there is an apparent congruence between levels 1 and 7. 7 is called not surviving, and 1 says no survive, no need to survive. So not surviving can easily be mistaken for no need to survive. So you could have a person who's so successful, he retires. So he's not attempting to survive in any context. He's just retired. And then at the bottom, you have not surviving. This is someone who's not even established. So let's say you have a homeless person out on the street who's an alcoholic. He's at level 7. He's not established in anything. He doesn't have a home. He doesn't have a job. He doesn't have a family. He doesn't have a following. He doesn't have a career. He's not established. And then you have a person at the top who, in a sense, is not established. He's retired. He plays golf. He goes swimming. He watches the news. So, see, he's not in the game of survival anymore. So, as I explain in the book, all of the games of life are played by people at levels 2 through 6. People at 1 and 7 are not in the game. They're outside of the game. Now, this is a quantum scale. This is not obvious at all. But I can tell you from long experience with this scale that you jump from level to level instantaneously. You're at, let's say, level 3, and then something happens and suddenly you're at level 2. So it would take a billionth of a second, perhaps, to go from level 2 to level 3. Now, as with all quantum scales, you could be doing things at level 3, very busy, and then all of a sudden, you're at level 2. So this is not a gradation. Now, this is a specific scale, meaning it has a context. How is the person surviving in his family? How is this person surviving in his job? How is the person surviving in his religion? How is the person surviving in his political context? You see, there are many different specific contexts to use this. So you might have a guy who's at a very high level as an individual, but in the familial context, he's at a very low level. So you could have a guy who's a billionaire. That's level 2, survival secured. But he doesn't have a wife, he doesn't have a family, he doesn't have a home. See, that's a different context. In that case, he might be at 5 or 6. Theoretically, he could even be at 7, although that would be rare for a person with a lot of money. So that's what you have to realize. Now, when you learn this scale, when you learn this scale, you can develop a sensitivity as to what level am I at. So, for example, I'll be going along, busily doing something in a certain context. All of a sudden, I realize, I've dropped down a level. See, something happened. I'm not at 4 anymore. I'm at 5. And then I get busy right away, very busy, getting back up to 4. Or the opposite will happen. I'll suddenly realize, I'm at level 3. So this is something that you really need to know because, as I explained in the chapter, failing to know the level you're at is a catastrophic mistake always, 100% of the time. And I'll give you an example. This is one of the examples in the book. The American education system has been losing ground, meaning level 5, for generations. Nobody has acknowledged this. Nothing has been done about it in the large context. Now, there are things that individuals did about it, such as homeschooling or private schooling, to get the kid out of the succumbing system and into a system that would actually help the kid. But those are individuals. That's not the entire system. So when you see disasters and catastrophes, it's because people misassess it. A good example for an individual would be Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley went right up this scale in the 50s. And he got to survival secured, where he had unlimited funds, bodyguards and estates and everything else. He had security, right? But he died as a young man. How did that happen? He killed himself with pharmaceuticals. So what happened there is he did not go to level 1 because once you have survival secured, if you do not then go up to level 1, there is the chance that you're going to deteriorate. So it's much smarter. That's why people retire. Guy says, well, I've got $20 million in the bank. I own my house outright. That's enough. He retires. See, he goes up to 1. No need to survival. He doesn't go to the office anymore. See, he's in retirement in that context. Now, if he's in a marriage, he can't do that, right? He has to continually pay attention. Okay, so let's say he's at level 3, which is success. His marriage is a success. Well, wouldn't it be better if he moved it up to security, where it's survival secured? This is what you see when you have a couple that is really committed to one another. They're not going anywhere. Okay? This is a happy marriage. So it's important to pay attention to this. And of course, you can't pay attention to this if you don't know that it exists. But I've been using this for most of my adult life. It took me a while to sort of figure out the wording and exactly what goes with what, exactly what each one means. But I was using this long before I got the idea of Septemics. I had this scale, and like most of the other scales, they came to me in bits and pieces. So let's start from the bottom. So you have somebody who's not surviving, right? So this is something, let's take football. Guy doesn't know anything about football, doesn't watch it, doesn't know anything about it, right? He's not established. So if he suddenly decides, I'm going to play football, right? The dad says, come on, Johnny, I'll throw the football to you. He says, what's a football? Well, it's this funny looking ball here. So they go out in the garden and the dad throws the ball, right? This little kid now is at level 6. He is in peril on the football context. Now, collapsing doesn't really tell you much because that's looking at it from the top down. But he's not stable. Now, if the dad then says, let's look at it on TV, see, and the kid starts to find out about it, say, oh, this looks interesting. Now, he will move up to 5. Now, in 5, again, losing ground is how it looks from the top. But from the bottom, he's not in peril anymore, but he's still succumbing. In other words, he's not really stable in the football world. Well, then he joins kids' football, right? And he's on a team. See, now he's kind of breaking even. He's kind of at stability. And then if he does well, he becomes the starting fullback of the team. He goes up to 3, he goes into high school and becomes a football star. See, he's the star running back. Now, at that point, maybe he gets discovered by the NFL and he becomes a pro and they pay him $3 million a season to play for them. Now he's at survival secure. You see, he's secure. All of this is in the context of football. It says nothing about the rest of his life. And then after a while, he retires. So Jim Brown, the greatest football player who ever lived, left at the pinnacle of his career. He left football because he came to realize that he could be a movie star. He didn't have to get beat up by 300-pound defensive linemen. He could become, and he did. He just quit and he became a movie star. And he made much more money in the movies than he ever made in football without getting kicked around. So he retired. He went up to level 1, you see? And so he moved on to something else. He left the football context. And then he went into the acting context, the movie star context. So he started again at level 7 as an actor. And he went up that pretty fast, just the way he did as a football player. He went up pretty fast. He became a star. So eventually he got to, as a movie star, he got to survival secured. I don't know how many $1 million he had. I'm sure you can look it up. A lot. Because he was the star of many big productions. And eventually he retired from it. So he went up to level 1 in that context. See? Different context. So you need to look at this always and know, where am I? Because that tells you what to do. Remember, the whole point of Septemics is if you accurately assess the level you are at, then you know the next level up and you target yourself for that. So let's say you're in a business and you're breaking even. Okay, that's stability. Well, it is well known that in nature, all equilibriums are unstable. There's no such thing as a stable equilibrium. So if you're breaking even, I'm calling it stability in the sense that you're not going out of business, but you can't stay there forever. It's very difficult to stay at breaking even. You're either going to go up or you're going to go down. So you better move yourself up to level 3. That's success. Now you're making money and you have money in the bank. So when COVID hits, you can pull $1 million out of the bank and keep your business going so that when COVID is over, you still have a business, as opposed to the thousands or millions of people that just lost their businesses. Everything shut down. They had no money coming in. So they just went right down the scale and out the bottom, back to not surviving. So people who were gaining ground, they had workable businesses. COVID came in. Nobody would come in anymore. After a short period of time, they're breaking even. They're not making money anymore. And then they're losing ground. Fewer and fewer people are coming in. They can't afford to make the rent. Then after a while, they're collapsing. We're going to have to go out of business, and they go out of business, and that's level 7. So that's how this works. And I'm telling you, if you do not know the level you're at, you are going to have trouble. Now, it is, if I recall correctly, it's something like 90% or 95% of new businesses in the United States go out of business. I'm sure that is true in the rest of the industrialized world. So a guy decides to go into business and he goes broke, right? We see this all the time because he did not know this scale. He did not know how to work your way up and spot where you are. Because remember, the principle that I have oft cited in this subject, 90% of finding the right answer is asking the right question. When you know the level you are at, you are then asking the right question, which is, how do I get to the next level up? I'm giving you the next level up on all of the scales. So if you're losing ground, your target is breaking even. We don't want to be losing money. We want to have enough money coming in that we can pay all our bills. That's breaking even. When you're at level 4, you say, we're breaking even now. We had as much money coming in this month as we had to pay out. So you're level 4. Then you target yourself for level 3. Now we're going to go for success. And when you get up to gaining ground, you'll see, we're gaining ground. We're having more money coming in now than we're spending every month. See? Because you're gaining ground, because you're putting that money in the bank. You see? And then if you continue to succeed, eventually you'll get to survival secured. You become an established business where Home Depot or Lowe's or Walmart, they have security. They have security because they have name recognition, they have a following, they have money in the bank, they have millions of people working for them who pretty much know what they're doing. You see, their survival is secured. This is what often is called too big to fail. We talk about banks going out of business. The government's not going to let them go out of business. They're going to bail them out. They're too big to fail. And they know that. So that's what happened recently with that bank in San Francisco, that they went broke. And so the government went in there and propped them up. Now, eventually that bank was bought by another bank. So that's the common thing in the banking world. In case you haven't noticed, there are a few huge banks that are gobbling up all the small banks, and that's been going on for decades now. There was a period there where I'd open a bank account, and then suddenly it was another company. And then a year later, there was another company. So, it's the Washington Bank. Now we're PNC. Okay, we have to get all new website and everything else. So then, wait a minute. So now we're Chase. They're gobbling them up. So these are the big banks gobbling up the small banks. And this doesn't only happen in banking; it happens in all kind of business. I mean, most people have startups. What they intend to do is get to some point where Apple or Amazon or Walmart or somebody will buy them out. So Facebook comes in, says, you have a good app, we'll give you $3 million. Thank you very much. They take their $3 million and go home. Okay, they're done with that. That is now property of one of these big corporations. So this is where the idea of monopoly comes in. You have monopolies. So there are, of course, laws in the United States, and I assume in other countries too, against monopolistic practices. I know in the United States, it's a difficult subject because you actually have to prove that you're harming the people. And that's not easy to do. There's lots of people who are going to say, I love Walmart. And all the mom and pop shops that were obliterated by Walmart. Walmart comes into a town, 20 businesses go out of business because they can't compete with Walmart. Because when Walmart buys, let's say, an aluminum pot, they'll buy 1 million aluminum pots. And they'll buy them from China or someplace like that. And they get them for some tiny fraction of what all these other companies would have to pay for them. So when you go into Walmart, you can get this aluminum pot for much less than in other stores. That's their business model. So there are people who will argue, well, it's not monopolistic because I can go there and I can buy this pot for $2 instead of paying $4. See? And that's why in the United States, at least, monopoly law is somewhat hamstrung by these precedents. You have to prove that there is a victim. So there are people who've been saying for decades, millions of people, Amazon is a monopoly. Facebook is a monopoly. But how can you prove that people are being harmed by it? That's what the prosecutor would have to prove. And that is a difficult thing to prove. So that is why it's allowed to go on. So that is, when you get up to survival secured, that's what a monopoly is. Peter Thiel, a rich businessman, famously said, that's the whole idea, is to have a monopoly. That's why you go into business. You don't want to have a competition. You want to have a monopoly. So that's what this scale is about. So you can look at it from the bottom or look at it from the top. The way it's constructed verbally is looking at it from the top. So you see, and the reason I did that is that it helps people understand what kind of hot water they're getting themselves into. So you have a guy, you have a successful business. After a while, they're not making money, but they're breaking even. Bad sign. You got to fix that right away. And if they don't, eventually they'll start losing ground. They start succumbing because something happens, like COVID. Or your manager dies, okay, who is the smartest guy in the business. So now they're losing ground. And if you don't fix that, we'll go down to collapsing. So let me give it to you another way. It is well known that in horsemanship, the most dangerous moment is mounting the horse. I don't know if you've noticed that. When you try to mount a horse, he will usually move right away. Most horses will not simply stand there when you try to mount them. So you better know what you're doing and do it quickly. You just got to be zip, you're on. If you're fooling around with it, you're going to have a lot of trouble because that horse is going to move. That's level 6. You're going from not being in a question to being in a question when you're mounting the horse. So when you're trying to get on that horse, you're at level 6. Once you get on the horse's back, you're not breaking even yet. You're still succumbing. You see, you haven't gotten anywhere. So now, if you can control the horse, you get him to go this way or that way. Okay, now you're breaking even. You see, you're at stability. Yeah, I'm up here, I'm riding, everything is fine. The horse is happy. See? Now, if you're going to go beyond that, where you become an equestrian or a jockey, well, then you get into this higher level where you're gaining ground. You see? So it doesn't matter what the context is. This applies. So let's say you have a car, right? You're not in your car. you're at level 7. You're not surviving as a driver because you're not driving. So you go out to your car, right? You have to get the car to open. You have to get the engine to start, right? You have to put your seatbelts on. All of that is level 6. See, there's peril there. Maybe I don't have my key. Maybe my battery's dead. Maybe the car won't start. You see, you're at level 6. So then, once you get the car started, you've got your belt on, the lights are on, the mirrors are adjusted. Now you start to move. Okay, now you're at level 5. Now, you're not really at stability yet. You're still saying, I wonder if there's anybody coming who was it safe for me to go out, you see? And once you get out on the road, you're rolling, you're at a cruising speed, the limit's 35, you're doing 35, everything is set. Now you're breaking even. Now, when you get to gaining ground, that's you're on the freeway and you're going 75 miles an hour to get where you want to go and being guided by your GPS. See? So now you get to where you want to go. You're there. Survival secured. And you get out of the car. You lock the car. That's level 1. You've just retired from being a driver of a car. So you see, this scale goes all the way down from the most quotidian possible things up to the level of Amazon and Walmart, up to the level of governments like the federal government. The federal government of the United States is over $34 trillion in debt. Nothing like that has ever happened before in history. Okay? That is level 6, collapsing. Well, hello, look at the United States. Crime is on the rise. The borders are open. 60% of Americans are living paycheck to paycheck. The veterans aren't being taken care of. You have vast homelessness. You go into a city like LA or San Francisco, like thousands and thousands of people living on the street. Okay? That's a collapsing country. Well, if you just look at the fact that it's $34 trillion in debt, that's collapsing. They're not just succumbing, they're collapsing. And most of the people in the United States now realize that, of either party. They realize that they're in peril because why do you think inflation has been out of control for the last 3 years in the United States? That did not surprise me at all. I was waiting for that to happen because I know the scale. I knew it was going to happen. And I would just wake up every day and say, oh, is it inflation? Oh, it hasn't come yet? Okay, it'll come tomorrow. And it did. So, because I know the scale. So, this happens to governments. It happens to countries. So, the United States now is almost to the point of a civil war. We have 26 states who have joined forces against the federal government as regards immigration. And there's actually some discussion of are the Texas National Guard going to fire on the federal immigration officials? That's the discussion that's going on now. I don't think most people think that's going to happen, but that's level 6. So if it's not fixed quickly, the United States will not survive. It'll be taken over by a foreign country, or it will break up the way it did in 1861, and you'll have 2 or 3 countries. I could easily see the United States breaking up into several different countries. You have the so-called red states and the blue states. I don't think it's hard to imagine the red states becoming one country and the blue states becoming another country. There is more hatred, animosity, conflict between the red states and the blue states in the United States now than there was between the North and the South during the Civil War. Because if you were alive during the Civil War, unless you were actually in the army and fighting, you were just around your people. In other words, the Southerners were surrounded by Southerners, the Northerners were surrounded by Northerners. You know, the Southerners hated those damn Yankees, and the Yankees looked down on the Southerners. But you were living in Massachusetts. You didn't travel around a lot. You see, now I have had several occasions where I was unlawfully victimized because I allowed a political opinion to be known. And I'm talking by government officials. So like sometimes if you give money to a political party, they'll say, oh, send us money, we'll send you a bumper sticker. No, thanks. You can have the money, but I don't want your bumper sticker because somebody will vandalize my car. And it doesn't matter what side you're on, because as far as I'm concerned, the United States has been in a civil war since about 2000. And it's just getting worse and worse. You know why it's getting worse? Nobody knows the scale. So they just don't know what to do. Okay. They just passed or are talking about passing another continuing resolution. More debt. Okay. So the debt now is much greater than the budget for the military. That is a recipe for non-existence. Because I've heard generals say, if we were attacked by the Chinese now, we would lose. And I believe them, because knowing as much as I do about military science and political science, I think that's true. Will anything be done about it? Well, it remains to be seen. Certainly there's turmoil, and the turmoil is because they don't know this. Same thing in the education establishment. The education establishment just keeps getting worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. So now we have rife anti-Semitism in the universities. That shouldn't even exist. So what do you think happened to Germany? They lost World War I and they went down, 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 down. Eventually they got taken over by a psychopath, and then they got defeated in World War II. So they went right down these levels. So when World War I started, Germany was a prosperous, powerful, secure country. Okay, then World War I came in, which was the worst war in human history at that time. It was called the War to End All War. Well, hello, how did that work out for you? It's basically, it destroyed Europe. And of course, England wound up losing its empire. The Germans wound up being bombed into the Stone Ages in 1945. So you can just watch countries. Now, if you study Oswald Spengler, who I recommend, he says something similar to this, where his thesis is that empires have a life cycle, and every empire has a spring, a summer, a fall, and a winter. And he goes through in his book the four major empires that we know of: the Egyptian, the Chinese, the British, and the Roman. And he shows how they all went through the cycle. Well, the United States is now in what Spengler would call the winter of its empire. In other words, it's at level 6, it's collapsing. Now, of course, when the Roman Empire fell, all those people didn't just disappear, they didn't just die, they went on, they stumbled into the Dark Ages and lived through a dark period until the Renaissance came about, which was 1,000 years later. So if you go through the study of the Roman Empire, which I have done, you can just see them go right down the scale. There was a time when all roads led to Rome. There was Pax Romana. And then, because they didn't know the scale, they just went down, 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 and eventually they collapsed and they stopped existing. The Roman Empire stopped existing around 1500 years ago. And the remnants were picked up by the Catholic Church, which then became the dominant force in Europe for the next 1500 years. Any questions?
No questions. Fascinating. Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, the scale of management. If you intend to manage anything, you need the scale. And I'm not just saying this as far as being in business. If you have a family, you have to manage your family, don't you? You have a household, you have to manage your household. If you have anything at all, you have to manage it. And you can see this all the time. There are people who just mismanage everything. They mismanage their lives, they mismanage their finances. Management has 7 levels. You have to have the 7 levels. Every business or enterprise begins at level 1 and then proceeds down to level 7. Now, in this case, we're not talking about declining as we were in the last scale. We're talking about fulfilling the functions of management. So when you see a business fail, you can analyze it against this scale and you will find functions of it are missing or failing. So this is a spiral scale, meaning there is an apparent congruence between level 1 and 7. It's very easy to mix up the establishment of a business with the marketing of a business. And more importantly, this scale spirals on itself. In other words, when you get to level 7, you don't just stop. You sort of go to level 1 and go through the cycle again. So this is why you see spin-offs. So you have a successful TV show, and it goes through all of this, it's successful, and then it has a spin-off. Well, that spin-off is starting at level 1 again. So that's the spiral aspect of it. So there was one show in the 50s that had 4 spin-offs, 4 TV shows that came from that one show. So in each case, that successful show had 1 through 7, and then they started with the spin-off, started at 1 again, and went through that whole cycle. So this is not about the scale of survival. See, we just did that. This is the scale of management. It's a different thing. Now, this is a quantum scale, meaning there is nothing in between these levels. There's no gradation. You're at level 1 or you're at level 2. They are different functions. And if you have this blurred in your mind or blurred in your organization, you are in a lot of trouble. You have to realize these things are distinct. Now, this is a specific scale, meaning it goes to whatever you're managing. So you could be using this to manage your family, using this to manage your business, using this to manage your club. Even if you are a guy who sells hot dogs in a hot dog stand, right? By himself. That's a business. He's got a license from the city and he goes out, or he sells chestnuts, right? In Manhattan, you have guys roasted chestnuts. It's a living. Now, that guy has to have these 7 functions. And if he doesn't, he will fail. And I'll tell you in a minute what those are. Now, notice this says, this scale aligns with the scale of human ability. Now, if you recall, when we covered the scale of human ability, it talked about 7 levels of human ability. Now, that is the individual manifestation of what we're looking at here as a group manifestation. So in humans, you have ability, but in groups, you have management. So when you manage something, it's some kind of a group. Because remember, that guy who sells chestnuts, he's got to interact with whomever he's selling those raw chestnuts. He's got to interact with whoever's selling him the fuel by which he cooks them. He's got to interact with whoever sells him the cart. He's got to interact with the city who gives him a license. He's got to interact with every person who comes to him to buy roasted chestnuts. You see? So this idea that you're doing it alone, that's preposterous. I mean, even if you're a hermit living in the woods, like that crazy guy, Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, he lived in the woods, okay? He built some little shack, okay? You have to have some kind of utensils. Where are you going to get those from? You have to have some kind of fuel. If you're going to go hunting, you have to have some kind of way to do that. So it's almost impossible. You can get to preposterous things like a hermit living in the woods, but how many hermits are living in the woods? I mean, if you go to primitive societies, they don't live alone. They have societies. They have families. That family has to be managed. If the family is successfully managed, it's a happy family. If it's not a happy family, it's because it's not been successfully managed. So you have to have these 7 functions. Now, the way the human ability comes in is when a person comes into your purview or into your sphere of influence, he's going to be at one of these 7 levels. There are no exceptions. And you have to know how to interact with that person. You see, if a person is an ignoramus, that means he doesn't know that he doesn't know. He doesn't even know what you're doing. He doesn't know what you're selling. He doesn't know what you're purveying. He doesn't know what you do. He doesn't know anything. What do you do with him? Level 2, you interact with him. That's all you can do. You can say, hello, how are you? See, you can't even sell this guy anything because he doesn't know what you're doing. Now, if a guy's a layman, now you can promote him. See, he understands what a butcher is, that you sell meat. He wants to buy some meat. All right, come in. We're having a sale this week. Pork is 10% off. Oh, good. I'll come over. See, you can promote. You can sell something to him. So that's how these 2 scales interlock. Now, as I said, when we cover the scale of human ability, your amateur is your best customer. This is very well known. Whom do you think is going to subscribe to the golf channel? Somebody who plays golf. He's an amateur golfer. See, somebody who doesn't even play golf, he's not going to watch golf. Or who's going to subscribe to MLB, right? You go on the internet, you pay them a yearly subscription, you get all the games, right? 99% of those guys played baseball, played amateur baseball. They were amateur. And then after they grew up, they became amateur coaches. So you see, that's where the money comes from. That's why it corresponds to level 4, which is finance. If you took the amateurs in any field out of your public, you would collapse. Who do you think goes to stock car races? People who are interested in cars, people who are interested in stock cars, people who fix cars, car enthusiasts. See, there's a whole world of amateur stock car racers. Those are the guys who support that industry, the stock car industry. If you take them out of your public, you collapse. That's where your money comes from. That's why it corresponds to level 4, which is finance, and et cetera, et cetera. So I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but it's covered in the book on both chapters. So first thing that happens if you're going to manage anything is you have to establish it. So you have a husband and wife, they get married. They just created a family or household. See, they established it. Now, the next thing is they have to interact. They have to have some way to interact with people. So what do? Well, in the old days, they would install a telephone in their apartment. Now we have cell phones. It's a little bit different. but they're certainly interacting. You know, the husband says to next door neighbor, "Oh, this is my wife, Mrs. Smith." Oh, hello. See, they're interacting. That's communication. So that's the next thing you have to have. Now, there has to be some promotion. Yeah, so that's what a housewarming is. You have a housewarming. All the neighbors come over, they all bring food and drink and everything. See, you're promoting this thing. Now, the next thing is finance. Well, you have to have money coming in. The, the husband or the wife or both have to go to work so that there's finance to keep this going. See, it's very well known that most marriage problems are money problems, right? The husband loses his job, so then he can't afford to make the house payment, so they lose their house, and the husband and wife wind up breaking up. You see, most fights in marriages are about money. Why did you spend $200 on a Derek Jeter jacket? We needed that money to buy tutoring for little Johnny. You see, that's a fight. So you have to have finance. Now, then you have to have production. Well, what's production in a marriage? It's what happens between the wife and the husband, not only in the bedroom, in the kitchen, in the dining room, in the garden. Okay? So he's being a husband, she's being a wife. They're producing something. And if they're not, it's not going to work. Well, then what happens next? Now you have to refine it. So the wife says, I wish you wouldn't throw your socks on the floor if you take them off. Just put them in the hamper. He says, okay. See, that's refinement. It's a correction. Now, if that refinement doesn't happen, you're going to have trouble. The wife's going to get mad. See, she'll say, I told you a week ago not to leave your socks on the floor, and you're still doing it. You see, it didn't get corrected. That becomes a fight. Here come the divorce lawyers. And the next thing is marketing. You export this thing. Well, in a sense, when you have children, you are sort of exporting your marriage to the world. So you bring little Johnny to class, right? And the teacher has a relationship with the parent. That's the PTA. And so you're kind of exporting the family. So this is what we call nepotism. So you have the parents are always going to, if they're within a family, even slightly, they're going to promote the well-being of the children. So that's a kind of marketing. So you see, even in a ridiculous contest like that, this works. It's much more obvious in a business. So you have, let's take Sears and Roebuck. I think they're out of business now. Well, it started out with one guy, I think it was Mr. Sears, who was a train conductor. And on the side, he would sell watches to people. Watches were very important during the railroad era. And so every person on a railroad had a watch. This is before wristwatches. Had a pocket watch. So this guy was selling pocket watches. And this became so profitable, he said, I don't need this railroad job anymore. I'm just going to sell watches. See? And then he hooked up with his partner, Roebuck, and the rest is history. Became a multi-billion-dollar business. Sears Roebuck was really the backbone of American consumer finance, consumer marketing for a long time. Way before Walmart existed, it was Sears Roebuck. Because you had people, they had this catalog. Well, the catalog could go anywhere. So you'd have some guy on a farm in Nebraska, and he would go through this catalog. You see, 1,000-page catalog. Oh, this is exactly what I need right here. And he would order it from Sears and Roebuck, and they would deliver it to him. So that was a workable business model. So somebody establishes the business. So in the case of Apple, it was Steve Jobs. He created Apple. Okay? So once he created it, then you have to have interaction. You have to have somebody interacting with somebody. So that would be the people, the receptionists. It would be talking to landlords. See, when you uh, start a business, you have to have a place to put it. So you need a building. Somebody contacts the landlord. That's interaction. You see, you're communicating. You can't just create it without communicating. If you don't communicate, there's nothing there. So then you go to promotion. Well, promotion, you're saying, we're here, we do this, we're creating this product or service, and you're going to like it. See, that's promotion. If your promotion is successful, you get money. People say, okay, I'll buy it. So you have billions of people buying iPhones. That's finance. You suddenly have all this money coming in. Accounting, you have to hire accountants. They have whole departments who just manage the money, keep track of all the money. Then, once you have money, now production is the next thing. Now you're saying, well, wait a minute, how did you get the money if you didn't have the product? Well, that's where venture capitalists come in. You see, a guy has a startup. He says, I've got this app that I made. He interacts with people about it. He promotes. Eventually, he gets to a venture capitalist. The guy says, okay, you need $3 million. Here it is. I want 20% of the business. See? Now the guy starts promoting, producing. So now you can go to the Apple store and buy this app. But if that money were not there in the first place, it never would have happened. There has to be some finance underpinning the production. So the money has to come from somewhere. And after you have money, now you can produce. So a guy says, I have an idea. There's a certain type of shoe that I think people will like. And he goes to a bank. And the bank says, okay, we'll loan you $1 million. That's the finance. Now he starts making these shoes. He's manufacturing them. Well, what's the next thing that has to happen? Refinement. There has to be somebody there who knows what he's talking about to say, this is a good shoe and this is not a good shoe. This is a better shoe than that one. In other words, or it could be somebody saying, well, you're making them nicely, but you're going too slowly. Here's a faster way to do it. So you have to have refinement. So when you go into any business, it's like Jonathan Ive in Apple. He's like the head designer. He's like a design genius. You know how many designers Apple must have? Thousands, right? And he's the head. So he is in charge of refinement and correction of design. And then you've refined your product. Now what's left? You market it. You export it to the world. Now it's easy to mix these things up because sometimes if you don't know what you're looking at, you can think that one thing is another thing. So marketing is the last thing you do. You're exporting whatever it is that your product or service is. So the sine qua non is 5, the production. In other words, you have to have a product. If there's no product, there's nothing there. What is the product? So, but in order for the product to happen, you have to have some financing. Where do you get the machines from? Where do you get the money to pay the people? There has to be some finance. And before you get the finance, somebody has to promote something to somebody. You have to have somebody, like there was a famous story. I don't know if it was, I'm trying to remember if it was Steve Jobs or Bill Gates, who went to a bank to get money. And the bank said to them, we're not giving you the money. Why would anybody want to have a personal computer? They laughed at him, right? They didn't get it. So this is similar with another story like that is Springsteen. Who's Springsteen? Bruce Springsteen was turned down by every record company in New York. And this was in the early 70s when most of the record companies were in New York. before they had an exodus to LA. The exodus happened in the 70s. This is before that. Finally, he said, I'm going to write a great rock song that is going to knock everybody out. And he wrote Born to Run. And then he made a demo of it. And somebody finally said, okay, we'll sign you. If that hadn't signed, he was going to give up. So this is the way businesses survive. You have to have these 7 functions. It doesn't matter how big or small. This is the way governments have to be managed. And again, this is not the scale of survival. This is all the components that you need to have and in the sequence that they occur. And remember, it's a spiral scale. So when you have 7, you have marketing, then it feeds back into 1, and you establish something else. So an example of this is Tony Bennett, the great singer. Frank Sinatra famously said, Tony Bennett is the greatest singer in the world. And you have to realize they were competitors. Well, Tony Bennett had his big hit, I think it was 1952. And he sang for 50 years. But as he was getting older, he took up painting. And you know, he's been selling his paintings. They're good enough that people buy them. Now, is he as great a painter as he was a singer? No, he's not. But he was able to establish a different thing. So now his life is not just about singing, because in case you've listened to him, his voice is not what it used to be. I mean, I don't even know if he still sings, but if you listen to him, for example, in the 2000s or in the 90s, it's not the same voice. That the voice wears out after a while, like everything else. And so he was smart enough to get into something else. Elvis did not do that. He just stayed the king of rock and roll and eventually killed himself inadvertently by his abuse of pharmaceuticals. So this is not a small issue. You have to have these 7 functions, and there's a feedback loop where 7 feeds into 1, because the guy who established it is the guy who makes all the money. So, forgot his name again. You mentioned him, the guy from Facebook,
Mark Zuckerberg.
Yeah. Right. So Zuckerberg established Facebook, right, at Harvard. And eventually he became a multi-billionaire because all of that marketing, which was at 7, eventually accrued to him back at 1. You see, it comes back to you. So that's how business works. So when you buy stock, you are investing in some business, and when they thrive, the stock goes up and you make money. So you see, that's the marketing feeding back into the creation. So in a sense, when you give $1,000 to Amazon for their stock, you're creating the business. You're saying, here's $1,000 that you can use to make your business better and stronger and bigger. See, and they take it, and if they're run properly, they do that. And so then you get dividends. Your stock goes up. See? So that's the loop between 7 and 1. If you don't get to the point of exporting, you get nothing. So you'll have some guy who's a great guitarist, for example. Maybe this kid can play as well as Eddie Van Halen, hypothetically. And he's sitting in his basement playing. Okay? There's no product there. Nobody has heard anything. It's a tree falling in a forest and there's nobody there to hear it. At some point, he's going to have to go through these 7 things. He gets a manager, he gets an agent, he gets a backup band, see? And eventually, he starts making records and they're exporting these records. He's making money. Or he's going on stage and playing. People come in and buy tickets. You're marketing the tickets to the concert. If that doesn't happen, He's just some guy sitting in a basement who could be tremendously, and there are thousands, maybe millions of people like that who have spectacular abilities and nobody ever finds out about it for one reason or other because they were not able to establish. In other words, they were not able to manage it successfully. So if you have production, and there's nobody correcting it, you're going to have a lot of trouble. You have to have correction, what they call quality control. I don't care what you do. There has to be somebody. Now, if you have a small business, you can hold all of these functions yourself because it's a small business. So the guy who has a hot dog stand, he looks at the hot dog, he says, this is not a good hot dog. He throws it away. That's level 6, refinement. Or he says, I noticed that people like this relish better than the last relish. See, so now he only uses this relish on his hot dogs. See, that's refinement. So I'm taking it down to a very tiny little context. But this is how organizations live or die. Organization and management are two ways of saying the same thing. When you manage something, you organize something. You can't manage without organizing. You can't organize without managing. They are intertwined. So that's what this is about. Any questions?
No questions. Very good. And that brings us to a good stopping point for today as well. Jim, again, I want to say thank you. Thank you so much. These scales, so not that, perhaps not that the rest of them, the general scales weren't as like immediately understandable or helpful, but it seems like these general these group scales are so like definitive and easy to understand and pick apart and apply to lots of different areas. So very, very helpful. I'm excited to continue our journey on this.
Thank you.
Very good.
Your success is my reward.
Very good. Until next time, listeners, thanks for joining us. We'll be back again.